All right, we are going to look at a couple passages of Scripture tonight. This might be your first time here, but tonight is our second lesson in our Church of the Bible series, and we're just spending some time studying what the Church of the Bible looked like. I'm going to test your knowledge on some of the trivia, just two questions that were the most interesting to me that we talked about last week. How many of you remember how many different kinds of Baptists there are? At least what? What was the number? At least 65. Somebody said 76. That's pretty close. At least 65 different kind of Baptists. All right, and we're looking around at our modern culture in 2025 wondering, how did we get so many different kinds of Baptists from one church? And part of that is because there's a lot of time that has taken place between now and then. And so we talked about that, and then the other question was, how many different kinds of denominations are there? You remember? Between 30 and 45,000. That's right. Christian denominations, not world religions, but between 30 and 45,000. Even if you take the conservative number of that, which is 30,000, the low end, that's incredible to me to think about, that there are 30,000 different kinds of denominations across the world. But just one church in the Bible. Just one church. All right. So I mentioned in my prayer, my desire to see our church look like the New Testament church. So this is the question that we're asking. And the first thing that we came up with last week was that the early church was totally committed. And then tonight we're going to see the second characteristic is that they were also radically generous. What was the early church like? They were totally committed, and we spent some time talking about that, right? That they were devoted to teaching, they were devoted to fellowship, they were devoted to the ordinances, Lord's Supper and baptism, and they were devoted to prayer. And as a result of their total commitment to those things, the church just exploded in growth. Just thousands and thousands of people began to come to the church, and it also went out. It went across all different parts of the world as well. So, but we also know about the early churches that they were radically generous. So, two passages tonight. So if you'll take your Bible, let's go to Acts chapter 4 first. I want to read a passage out of there. And if that looks familiar, I preached on this passage several weeks ago on Sunday morning. But I want us to read something out of Acts chapter 4, and then our primary text we're going to be tonight is 2 Corinthians chapter 8. So let's find those two places. After that, verse 32, now the full number of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one said that any of the things that belonged to him was his own, but they had everything in common. And with great power the apostles were giving their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. Great grace was upon them all. Verse 34, there was not a needy person among them. For as many as were owners of lands or houses, they sold those lands and houses, and they brought the proceeds of what was sold and laid it at the apostles' feet, and that was distributed to anyone in the church that had a need. And so thus Joseph, who was also called by the apostles Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, a Levite, a native of Cyprus, he sold a field that belonged to him and brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet. All right? So, radical generosity. Everybody who had possessions or land or property or assets, they were selling those and bringing the proceeds into the church so that it could be distributed to everybody in the church and everybody could have what they needed. Okay? Radical generosity. Now, 2 Corinthians chapter 8. And this is what we'll key in on tonight. Just 5 verses here. We want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means, of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this, not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. I remember a piano teacher that I had. I've been taking piano lessons since I was 9 years old, and in piano theory and music theory, you learn something about dynamics. So if you're a singer, if you're part of the choir, you hear about musical dynamics. That there are parts of a song that sometimes it gets really loud, and sometimes it gets really soft, and sometimes it gets really fast, and sometimes it gets really slow, and sometimes it gets really big, and sometimes it gets really small. And the way that she introduced this to me when I was a young student, she said it's like the piece of music is breathing. And it swells sometimes when you're inhaling, and then it's when you exhale, it ebbs and flows and all of these things. John Piper was writing about this passage in 2 Corinthians 8, and he said there are some spiritual dynamics here. There's some movement that's happening. And he says that, here's what he says: grace comes down, joy rises up, and generosity flows out. Now, that's not just a one-time exception in the New Testament church. This is the norm. We see this all over the place. We see it in Acts chapter 2, Acts chapter 4, Acts chapter 11, Acts chapter 16. We see it in in the letter to the Galatians. We see it in the letter here. That these are the dynamics that are happening in the church. That grace comes down, joy rises up, and then generosity flows out. So it always happens that way in the New Testament. So there's just two things on your handouts that I want you to remember tonight. And here's the first thing that we learn from 2 Corinthians 8. And that is that radical grace always produces radical generosity. What was the early church like? They were incredibly generous. That's what they were known for. They were marked by their generosity. And I love what Paul is writing about here in these first couple of verses. He's talking about what radical grace looks like. Verse 1, we want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that has been given among these different churches. And what does that grace look like? Verse 2, for in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. And so radical grace is what we are introduced to at the cross. This is the message of the gospel. This is what we share whenever we talk to others and we invite others to know Jesus, is that when we take people to the cross and we talk to people and we share with people what God has done in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, that's not just a sacrifice that is out of some moral character of the heart of Jesus. He's just providing some sort of good example for us to follow. That the message of the gospel is radical. God Himself. There wasn't anybody on the earth that was qualified enough to make the sacrifice that could appease the wrath of God. So God had to send Himself. God sent Himself in human form to go to a cross, the one who was innocent and perfect, willing to give up His own life, lay His own life down for people who were not perfect, for people who were sinful. 2 Corinthians 5:21, the one who knew no sin became sin for us, so that we might become the righteousness of God. That's a radical event. That's not just brotherly love, sisterly love, nice things that people do for each other. But that's what radical grace looks like. And Paul is saying to this church in Corinth that kind of radical grace that we receive from God at the cross produces a radical kind of generosity. Now, when I read verse 2 should not make any sense to us. Right? We should already be looking at verse 2 and be able to identify what seems to be a contradiction. It's a paradox there. A paradox is this obvious contradiction. It seems to contradict or cancel each other out. So what is it about verse 2? I think this is on your notes. What is it about verse 2 that seems to be a contradiction? Can you see it? Okay? Poverty and generosity. All right? How can such extreme poor people be so extremely generous? And so here is Paul saying that these people were not just poor, not just they didn't have a lot, they had extreme poverty. The word poverty there in the original language is the word that best describes people who have nothing. And so the contradiction, or it seems to be contradiction, how can people who don't have anything be so generous and give things? And it's because of what God had done in their lives through grace. And they were willing to give whatever they had. So either Paul in verse 2, he's either using hyperbole here, he's trying to exaggerate, to prove a point, or he's being literal. And I think it's clear he is being literal here. So how does this make sense? Right? How does this contradiction of people who are extremely poor, they don't have anything, but they're extremely generous? How can he be extremely generous and not have anything to give? And I love what Paul is outlining here and trying to get us to understand. And here's how we make sense of this. Because, and this is the question we ask, how can poor people be generous? When it comes to biblical generosity, watch this, sometimes more is less and less is more. That's how we make sense of verse 2. So let's try to wrap our minds around this a little bit. When it comes to biblical generosity, sometimes less is more and sometimes more is less. It depends on how you're looking at this. This does not make sense mathematically. Right? $100 is always going to be more than $10. Mathematically. Right? But that's not what Paul is outlining as biblical generosity here, right? But it is more if you're talking about not mathematically, but proportionally. Suppose all I have was $10. That's all I had to my name was $10, and I gave that $10. And there's another guy over here that's got $1 million in the bank, and he gives $1,000. Well, who gives more? Mathematically, that guy did. But proportionately, I did because I gave everything that I had. And this is the concept of biblical generosity that the Bible is trying to get us to understand. This is why the generosity of these churches in Macedonia was commended. And by the way, this is taught in many, many other places in Scripture as well. You don't have to turn there, but Luke chapter 21. I know that some of y'all have know this and understand this passage well, but Luke chapter 21, remember, Jesus is talking about the widow's offering. He says, Jesus looked up and he saw the rich putting their gifts into the offering box. And then he saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. And he said, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she contributed out of her poverty. She put in all that she had to live on. So this makes sense when you look at it proportionately and not mathematically. All right, and this is what Paul is trying to get us to understand here. Radical grace transforms people into radical givers. All throughout the early church. Right? It is not within our natural inclination to give. We got a lot of people here tonight, and you probably love to give. We have a lot of people who are generous, and we're not just talking about money, but time and energy and talents and gifts and all kinds of different things that people give. But I think I heard a pastor say one time, I think it's more natural for people to grab than to give. That's just our human nature and what we were born with, because our sinful flesh is inherently selfish. I know nobody in here tonight is inherently selfish, but everybody else, we're born with an inherently selfish flesh. It is more natural for us to grab and to take than it is to give. If you don't believe that, go volunteer in the nursery one Sunday morning at Cedar Creek Baptist Church, and you'll see. Yes, you'll be able to see that. I was at a funeral service yesterday, and I was sitting next to Joe Clay and Miss Diane, and there are a few others that were there as well. Miss Methuselah, I saw you there as well, and there may have been a few others. I was sitting on the back row of this funeral. It was at Sandy Level, and I'd never been to Sandy Level. It was my first time being there. And so we were there in the service, and Mr. Ben Newman was one of the guys who was speaking, and I always love to hear Brother Ben speak. I wish that we could spend more time with him. But I was at this funeral service sitting on the back row, and there was this precious little girl there that was part of the family, and she was sort of sitting right in front of me, but several pews in front of me, and probably about 18 months old, just a little tiny thing, just beautiful, blonde, curly hair, big blue eyes, had this big, beautiful white bow in her hair, and she was one of these babies that looked like she should be on the cover of a magazine, right? I mean, she was just beautiful in every way. And I was watching her, and I had this thought about halfway through the service that this beautiful little baby girl there was undoubtedly the most selfish person in that service yesterday at that church. Because all she cared about was herself. She didn't care that somebody was trying to talk. She didn't care that there was a lady that had passed away and we were trying to honor her. She didn't care that everybody else was distracted by all of the noise and carrying on that she was doing. And Mom and Daddy, they were doing their best. What in the world do you do with an 18-month-old? You can't sit them down and reason with them. I mean, I understand that. But the entire room, we were trying to listen to what was going on, and all of this was happening. And that's just our sinful nature. And we're all born with that. And it's kind of cute when it's an 18-month-old beautiful little baby, but it's not cute when you're 28 or 38 or 48 and all you care about is yourself. But the Bible teaches us that when we receive radical grace, when we receive the grace of God, the way that these churches at Macedonia received, it changes us. We ought to walk around every single day remembering what has been done for us. We ought to never leave the shadow of the cross. We ought to always remember what Jesus has given us. And so grace changes us from getters to givers. That's what this kind of grace does. It changes us from consumers to contributors. It radically changes the way that we think about our money, our time, our assets, our investments, all of those things that we have been given. And when we truly understand radical grace and how it changes us, then we begin to truly understand what Jesus meant when He said, "It is more blessed to give than to receive." Now, if we've never received radical grace, and that's changed or transformed the way we think about generosity, we don't understand what Jesus is saying there. What do you mean it's more blessed to give than to receive? I didn't think that way on Christmas morning growing up in my house. All I thought about was receiving. And, I always got mad when my brother Avery got more presents than I did, because he was the oldest, or he would say that it probably worked differently with him. But no, when we receive the grace of God in our faith or through our faith in Jesus Christ, it changes us from being consumers and getting to wanting to give. And so verse 2, it should not make sense that these people in extreme poverty were so extremely generous. A severe test of affliction, but there's abundant joy. How do you have abundant joy in severe affliction? Because of grace. What God has done for you. Extreme poverty, but a wealth of generosity. And so these are people that had nothing. They had less than nothing, but they're not bitter, they're not miserable, they're not complaining. They're filled with joy because they love to give. And that was one of the characteristics of the early church. I don't have anything, but I'll give whatever I've got. All right, and I love that about the early church. So, radical grace always produces radical generosity. Here's the second thing. It was just two things I want us to think about tonight, and that's this. That radical generosity is less about the money and more about the means. Jesus talked a lot about money. I think if you were to go back and read the Gospels again, you might be amazed at how much Jesus approached the subject of money. And money was not the issue with him. The heart was the issue, and money was a reflection of what you believed or what was going on in your heart. And so when you were generous, when you gave whatever you had and you were willing to give generously, it was a reflection not of just following the letter of the law, but you were giving out of love. You were giving because you trusted the Lord, and you know that what you have was given to you, and you want to give back because of what was given to you. So, yeah, I think that's true. Absolutely. So radical generosity is less about the money and more about the means. What he says there in verse 3, for they gave, notice he didn't say what they gave, he talked about how they gave. For they gave according to their means. So in other words, they gave what they could afford to give. That's what he meant. That's what it means to give according to your means. They gave, you can't give away what you don't have. So they gave what they had. They gave whatever they could afford to give. Now, Paul addresses this again with the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Listen to what he says in those 2 verses about this, about the tithe or the collection, the offering being taken in the early church. This is 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. Now, concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. In other words, you do the same thing that I told them to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. So this is an organized effort to collect the generosity of every member of the church so that it could all come into the church and then be distributed out as everyone had need. So, in other words, Paul is teaching here that my giving should reflect how the Lord has blessed me. That's what it means to give according to their means. Verse 3. My giving should reflect how the Lord has blessed me, and then also my giving should represent what God has blessed me with. This is what verse 3 means. Again, proportion, not mathematical. We're not keeping up with how much this person is given, how much that person is given. But giving out of what we have been given. All right? In the Old Testament, and Brother Kenny mentioned this a while ago, in the Old Testament, Israel was commanded to give a tithe. It's part of the law, written in the law. You must give a tithe. In the New Testament, there's no command to tithe in the same way that the Old Testament taught. In fact, it was, in the New Testament, it was just give more than that. There was an expectation to give whatever, not just a small portion, not just this 10% over here, but give out of all that you have been given. And it leaves it up to them to be able to do that. So God wants us to give because we love to give, not because we're required to give. And there's a huge difference in that. And these churches were commended because they gave according to their means. And Paul says there, and beyond their means. That's why it was a sacrifice. They gave more than they were, financially able to do, but whatever they had, they gave it. They sacrificed in giving that up. So radical generosity, this is what the church is known for, the early church. Radical generosity isn't something that happens when you give out of what you have left over. That wasn't what was going on in the early church. Let me take care of all my bills first. Let me make sure I got everything that I need first. Let me get my ducks in a row first. And then once I've got all of that paid off, if I have anything left over, then I'll give that to the Lord. I'll write my tithe out of that. That's not what was happening in the early church. Our generosity is not radical if we give out of what we have left over. That is giving from your means. And I hope we understand the difference here. Giving out of what we have left over is giving from our means. God expects us to give out of what we've been given. And that is giving according to your means. You see the difference? We don't give out of what we have left over. We give out of what has been given to us. So we don't, we don't take a look at what all that we have and then say, well, once I get everything else taken care of, and then if I have something left over, I'll I'll give to the Lord. That's not how the early church did. They gave according to what they had been given. Listen to something, I mentioned John Piper a while ago. He wrote a book several years ago called Desiring God, which is one of the best books that I've ever read. And listen to what he said about this passage. He said, when poverty-stricken Macedonians begged Paul for the privilege of giving money to other poor saints, we may assume that this is what they want to do, not just ought to do or have to do, but they really long to do it. It is their joy. It is an extension of their joy in God. To be sure, they are denying themselves whatever pleasures or comforts they could have from the money they give away. But the joy of extending God's grace to others is a far better reward than anything their money could buy them. I love that attitude about generosity. Now, I'm not going to ask you, but I know there may have been times in your life. I know there's been times in my life when Charlie and I first got married, and we didn't have anything. I mean, we were on WIC, and we were on food stamps, and we stood in bread lines. I mean, we did whatever we had to do to feed all those babies that we kept having back then. And you did what you had to do. And so I was a full-time student, and I was working 3 part-time jobs, and she was, at home with all those kids. I mean, you just do what you have to do in order to put food on the table. And we didn't have very much at all. And there were times I was tempted to, here's this paycheck that comes in, and you've got all of these bills, and you're faced with a choice, right? Do I give what I should give to the church and to God, or what can I do with that money? My kids need this, or I'd like to do this, or we've got a birthday coming up, or whatever. And we're tempted to take those things that we should give and say, well, man, I need this, and think about all what I could do with that money, and this is what Paul is addressing here and talking about the fact that they had such joy in giving it. Their joy in giving it was greater than the joy they would experience if they went out and spent it on something themselves. How do you develop that kind of generosity? Because of grace. Because Jesus Christ had changed their life. And it produced that kind of generosity. Now, there's no secret to this. This is the kind of church we ought to have. This ought to be our goal. We ought to be known as radically generous people. We ought to have a reputation in our community and in our state, and people that know us, that these people over there, they are radically generous. They love giving their time, talents, and treasure to people that need it. And we've got to make sure, not only corporately as a church, but individually, it starts with every one of us, that we've got to develop that kind of radical generosity as well. So the kind of giving in the early church was less about money and more about the means, how God had blessed them. And that's the church of the Bible. That's the kind of church we need to be. We need to be known for that. All right. Questions, comments, anything that anybody want to mention, ask, or talk about before we go?